Hello everyone. I want to take some time to introduce you to a concept that is going to be very important to understand as we continue through this course. It might not make sense at first, but we will always come back to it, so if it doesn't make sense right now, it will by the end of the quarter. That concept is neoliberalism, a set of economic policies and ideologies that are really the foundation of global economies. It affects our lives in a myriad of ways, which we will spend the next couple of weeks exploring. For right now, however, I want to just give you a primer on what this concept means. Neoliberalism emerged in social science and economic scholarship among scholars who focused on Latin America during the 1970s and 1980s. There were a few key things that happened during this time. Ronald Reagan was elected President of the United States, Margaret Thatcher was elected Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and Augusto Pinochet overthrew Salvador Allende in Chile, a democratically elected socialist president, through a military coup. This coup was successful due to backing by the CIA. The U.S. had a vested interest in Chile because Allende was instituting reforms to Chilean governance and economy that went against U.S. interests, particularly their interests in Latin American land and resources. For example, Allende wanted to nationalize resources such as copper, which would bring in lots of revenue, but would also reduce the ability for private ownership. See, the U.S. and other Western powers, like the United Kingdom, were undergoing an economic and ideological shift during this time. So after a period of economic deflation and stagnancy, the U.S. and the U.K. wanted to quickly stimulate economic growth, particularly for the wealthy. They believed that maximizing profits for the wealthy was the key to economic growth. So they implemented programs and global policies in tandem with the World Bank and International Monetary Fund to expand their economic empire and maximize profit for the economic elites. How this worked requires a lot of explanation, and we will explore that in another lecture. But scholars and activists who studied and worked in Latin America were documenting these changes closely. And they wanted to name what they were observing in the region, such as foreign direct investment of wealthier nations, Western nations, exploitation of land and labor, increasing poverty in already impoverished regions. And neoliberalism became the frame that they used to describe what they were seeing. So neoliberalism is a tricky concept with many components, and I'm going to go through all of them here, and we will revisit them throughout the course. The rest of these slides are really going to just give you the nuts and bolts. And so neoliberalism is essentially this idea that a free and unregulated market is the key to economic growth. And it accumulates wealth at the top. And the idea is that this wealth will eventually trickle down to everybody else. You may have heard the term trickle-down economics before. People who say that are referring to neoliberalism. And it kind of operates under the following tenets: government deregulation, privatization of public resources, cuts to social spending, and this emphasis on individualism and personal responsibility. So now what I want to do is I want to go through each of these tenets individually to give you some more context about what they mean. So the first one is government deregulation, and government deregulation is this idea that the government should reduce barriers to doing business. It should reduce or eliminate regulations on business practices. So what this means is that it should create incentives such as tax loopholes to allow businesses to retain their wealth, and that it should increase regulations on social spending to put federal resources towards corporate interests. So one thing that this gave rise to was deindustrialization. U.S. deindustrialization. So the real kind of nuts and bolts of government deregulation is this idea that if you reduce the barriers to doing business, it allows companies, in particular big corporations, to accumulate as much wealth as possible. And what happened is that manufacturing jobs in the U.S. went overseas, where land was cheaper and there were fewer labor and environmental regulations. And so manufacturing jobs in the US as a result declined drastically. Abandoned factories like the one in this photo of Detroit are a reminder of how quickly US workers lost their livelihoods. The second tenet of neoliberalism is privatization of public resources. So first, just quickly to define what I mean by public resources is really just resources owned by the public, which means that they are funded by taxpayer dollars. Okay? And through a neoliberal frame, there's this idea that publicly owned resources should come under the ownership of private companies. Some of the public enterprises that can come under private ownership include things like railroads and highways, our public utilities, so like our light companies and our water companies, hospitals and healthcare provision. So you've probably heard about this a lot in the news lately, right? So this idea whether we should have like publicly funded healthcare like Medicaid, or whether we should have emphasize private insurance companies. And schools can be privatized as well. The charter school systems are an example of how schools have become privatized. So the kind of two most common justifications for privatization is this idea that it's more efficient, right, when you can put it under private control than when you have something that's kind of run by government, right? And also that it gives consumers more choices. So for example, rather than having one state-run health plan, you can have the choice of several insurance companies, which makes it easier to find a plan that suits your needs. While that sounded appealing to many, increased choice and efficiency has not really been the outcome. And what has happened instead is really it concentrates wealth in the hands of a few. It reduces or even eliminates public accountability measures because when you're taking it out of public control, you're taking it out of taxpayer control and giving private owners a lot of power in how things get run. And it raises prices for the public as well. And most importantly, it really undermines democratic power, because the very definition of public is that it is, in theory at least, controlled by the people. When you take a public resource and put it into private ownership, any modicum of that or any modicum of democratic control really kind of goes out the window. The third tenet of neoliberalism is the retrenchment of social welfare, or otherwise just cutting spending to social programs. And so really it's this idea that minimal or no funds should be allocated to social welfare. So things like public assistance, food stamps, or public health care options like Medicaid. It's about a reduction on spending on public goods such as schools and roads. And it's this idea that federal spending should prioritize the ability of big businesses to maximize their profit margins. So when you take this in combination with deregulation and privatization, what happens is it makes it harder for individuals and families to find living wage jobs, to achieve economic upward mobility, and to live a dignified quality of life. Because what's happening when all of these things come together is with deregulation, things like there's a reduction in jobs, right? Privatization makes the cost of living higher, right? So paying for private insurance or private utility companies versus when it's a public good, right? The costs go up. And what happens when you cut social welfare is you cut the existence of a social safety net. So these things that people had really kind of come to rely on when they fall on hard times become less readily available, or they don't exist at all. So things like food stamps or public assistance, for example. And the justification for this is this idea, and we'll get into this a little bit deeper in a second, is this idea that it's the personal responsibility of the individual to lift themselves out of poverty, and that social welfare is a drain on the economy. That's actually not true. And a good example of this, though, is how when we're thinking about how we spend federal dollars, right, there's this idea of social versus corporate welfare. Right, and it's this idea that corporate tax programs, so like tax loopholes, government subsidies, low and no interest loans from the federal government, all of these things give billions of dollars every year to corporations, right? And the amount of money that we spend on that, on corporate welfare, is actually much, much higher than what we spend on social welfare, things like public assistance and food stamps. And for the latest numbers that I can find, I think the latest I found were from 2012, we spent $59 billion on social welfare, and corporate welfare, we spent $92 billion. So if we're looking at government spending and who we're spending it on, we're spending much more money on corporations than we are on social welfare programs. So they really aren't the economic drain that we think they are. And they actually make a very small amount of our government's budget. And so finally, when we're talking about neoliberalism, we're talking also about an ideology and this emphasis on individualism and personal responsibility. And this really is the ideological foundation of neoliberalism, and it speaks to neoliberal frames on democracy and human rights. So for purposes of this lecture, I am defining democracy as a people-controlled government. This is a bit simplified, but it will do for explaining this tenet. And I'm also using the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights as my understanding of human rights. So what individualism and personal responsibility comprise is a stance on rights and responsibility in a democracy. So when you hear the terms rights and responsibilities, there are three kind of key questions being asked. And that is, what are a citizen's rights in a democratic society? What responsibility does a nation have to protect and ensure the rights of its people? And what is the responsibility of the citizen? And from a neoliberal standpoint, it's the personal responsibility of the individual to ensure human rights. The primary responsibility of the state is to maximize wealth accumulation for the economic elite, and social welfare is seen as a barrier to economic growth. And really, democracy itself is seen as a barrier to economic growth. That one takes a while to really kind of wrap your head around, and we'll kind of revisit it throughout the quarter. So I think a really good example of this kind of individualist frame, Margaret Thatcher gave an interview in 1987 for Woman's Own. And she argued that there was no such thing as society. And it really became this kind of iconic interview in terms of neoliberalism and the scholars who studied this history, because she just really exemplified this emphasis on individualism and personal responsibility. And so what she says is, I think we have gone through a period when too many children and people have been given to understand, I have a problem, it is the government's job to cope with it. Or, I have a problem, I will go and get a grant to cope with it. I am homeless, the government must house me. And so they are casting their problems on society, and who is society? There is no such thing. There are individual men and women, and there are families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people look to themselves first. So this is what is meant by the emphasis on individualism, this idea that people must help themselves first. In some ways it makes sense, and it certainly resonated with middle-class sensibilities about work and family at the time. However, what it also does is separates the individual from their social reality. Individuals are making decisions about their lives, their bodies, their families within the context of laws, policies, social structures, and other factors of which they have little or no control. You can't separate the individual from the world they live in, yet ideologically this is what neoliberalism tries to do. And so one last point I want to make about neoliberalism is that although it was established by conservatives, neoliberalism is a bipartisan economic policy and ideology. The Clinton administration, for example, carried the torch after being the first Democratic administration in over a decade. Canada's current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, supports drilling and other environmental policies that are framed through a neoliberal lens. And so even though it was conservatives who really started this, it's not conservatives only who have carried this forward. And so a Democrat versus Republican divide is really not a good way to understand what we're seeing here. And these are my sources. Like I said, neoliberalism can be tricky to wrap your head around, but we will come back to it throughout the quarter. Thank you.